in isolation, every one role or every two roles makes sense, right? But then when you look at it in totality, if every department is adding 4 or 5 roles or whatever it might be, then the cash plan might not work.
We're the Headcount people. Our podcast talks about all things headcount management, and our guests are the masters. If you're in charge of planning, managing, or reporting on headcount and headcount spend, we'll help you crack the code on this delicate dance by giving you strategies and tools from the masters themselves. Make sure to subscribe and follow for every new episode right when it drops. Here's your host, Tushar Makija.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tushar Makija, and I am the founder and CEO of Team Ohana. And today, we are joined by Krishna Vallabhaneni, who is the VP of Finance at Grin. Welcome, Krishna. Welcome to the Headcount people.
Hey, Tushar. Yeah, happy to be here.
Great, Krishna. For the audience, I would love if you start by just giving a short introduction about yourself and tell us when you joined Grin and what were you doing before Grin, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Krishna Vallabhaneni, the VP of Finance at Grin, which is a creator management platform for consumer brands to manage influencer marketing campaigns. I've been here for about a year now, and I lead the finance and accounting teams, and we're responsible for your typical finance functions. And the way I like to describe is we ensure our financials are accurate, timely, and clearly communicated to stakeholders around the company. And then we also partner with our the various business leaders to provide analytical support and insights on our KPIs and how they impact our financial performance. Prior to Grin, I worked at similar roles at Clear and Revel Systems, both technology companies with subscription-based revenue models. And then right out of college, I learned the foundations of finance working in investment banking, private equity, and consulting.
That's great. So you've seen the full gamut, starting from banking and more traditional finance, now leading finance at a SaaS-based startup. Can you tell us a little bit about how big was Grin in terms of number of people and number of headcount when you started, and where you are today?
Yeah, so I think when we started, we were probably around a little under 300 employees or so, and now we're a little under 400 employees.
Okay, and then you said you have the whole finance and accounting and analytics reporting into you. What's the structure of your team today?
Yeah, so I have a controller reporting to me who manages corporate accounting, billing, accounts payable, revenue recognition, revenue accounting, and then she also does kind of procurement, just partnering with the various business leaders on negotiating contracts as well. And then on the finance team, I have a FP&A leader, a financial analyst, and then a senior manager of strategic finance that has a background in private equity. And so we have a pretty strong finance team that is well balanced. And I think the thing that I find really helpful at Grin is that our two teams talk to each other on a daily, weekly basis. And nice. As most finance leaders know, anything accounting team does impacts how the finance team is going to receive information. And so making sure that the two teams are kind of linked together and constantly communicating is really important, especially during the close process.
That's great. I think seems like Grin as a company and you as the leader of the finance team have put a lot of impetus in having the right stakeholders involved. Do you feel at your stage of a 400% company, the current size of the team is appropriate? Is that the right way other leaders should start thinking about how they set up their teams? Or if you think that you need to hire someone else, who would be your next hire?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first and foremost, having a strong accounting team is really important. So you can build out your finance side of the house and have, lots of people doing lots of analytics and lots of analysis. But if they're getting bad numbers, then it's garbage in, garbage out. So having a really strong accounting close team that can accurately close the numbers consistently and timely, because obviously everyone wants numbers on day one as soon as the month's over. And while that's easy pulling sales data out of Salesforce, it's a little harder doing that when you're doing revenue recognition and accrual expenses. And so I do think it's really important to get the accounting side of the house in tip-top shape first. And then you can kind of add and expand on the finance side, which is exactly what our team has done.
That's great. So because we are the headcount people, and now we will start, doubling down on having the headcount conversation. Who is responsible for managing headcount in your team today?
So it would be our FP&A team, our senior manager of FP&A, and he works really closely with our head of talent acquisition, as well as the VP of people. So our process is interlinked with their team, and it's a very collaborative process starting all the way back at the planning cycle. They're involved from the very beginning. It's I've worked in other environments where the finance team is just putting random start dates in the model, and then the recruiting team gets it and they're like, oh, well, that's not happening. Like, you want to hire a product manager with a specialized skill in the next 30 days, and I don't even have a job rec yet.
Right. So, and we've been hearing this more and more from finance leaders, is that this collaboration of actually understanding who we are going to hire and what should that be, what their skill set should be, and how long does it take to hire, actually truly informs a good headcount plan. But let's start at the highest level in your organization at Grin. How do you think about headcount planning at the highest level? What is the first step to building a company's headcount plan?
Yeah, I think most companies have an annual planning process, but then they will refresh it either monthly or quarterly. So let's make the assumption that you have a starting point, which is your annual budget. And so our process is that we have a quarterly reforecast cycle. And so we take a look at all the open recs, any new rec requests that come in from various departments, and we kind of match that up with recruiting capacity and the time to fill those roles. So a sales role, which you may have a lot of people already hired in, you already have the JDs, the comp is pretty standard, and those roles just tend to be to fill a lot faster than, let's say, either an engineer with a specialized skill or a product manager, or maybe a tax accountant, which might not be as easily easy to find. And so then we get an idea of how many roles can actually be filled in a quarter. We input realistic start dates. And so that way, every team, whether it's the marketing team, the sales team, they know that the recruiting team is signing up to fill this many roles next quarter. And so they can plan their goals around when those new roles might come in from a start date perspective. But I think your question also comes down to like, well, how do you know how many new roles you should add to the plan in any given quarter, right? And so what we do is we actually start with planning revenue, like with many subscription businesses, especially startups that are not cash flow positive. You need to really understand what your revenue growth is going to be in the next quarter, next 6 months, and even probably 2 or 3 years down the line. And getting a refreshed view of that every month, every quarter is really important, because the way I think about it is the more revenue you have, the more cash you're going to generate, and therefore the more people you can hire, right? So sometimes you can think of it as like a bottoms up or tops down approach, but either way, you have to get the pieces to kind of fit together. So you understand, if I add 20 new roles next year or next quarter, how does that impact our cash runway? And what is the sensitivity of sales needing to hit their number? Because as a finance person, that's responsible for managing the finances or financials and cash, you also want to have some level of sensitivity around what the sales team thinks they can actually accomplish too.
That's great. I really like how you have how you are running this process, because it's not just about how many roles you are going to hire or how much revenue you want to bring. You're also making it a very iterative and agile process, because as quarters go by, if you have to make adjustments, this process really helps you adjust and either pull back or actually accelerate hiring.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, because if your sales team is hitting it out of the park, you're going to be able to add more roles into the budget.
Right. So it's like so in a SaaS startup, it really becomes a product engineering planning and a sales capacity planning kind of an initiative that brings and dictates primarily the headcount plan. Is in this early process, when you are engaging with I would say the people leader, the talent leader, your CEO, and the engineering and sales leader, is there some guidelines or some key I would say best practices that you follow? Like, how would you, given the resources, let's take an example, given the resources, I think your engineering leader would say, yeah, I want to hire all of these different people into the company. Like, are you giving them some guidelines? Are you giving them some like a budget envelope? Like, where do they start? Or it's truly tell me what you need. Right.
Yeah, so I think one thing that we start with is having a very good documented timeline with like key milestones and dates. So we typically will run 1 to 2 rounds for every forecast cycle. It really depends on the way the calendar falls, when the next board meeting is, as well as if we're going to have like an offsite to review plans or anything like that. And then I think what we do is we share with all the leaders what their current spending budget is, as well as their current roster and already approved roles. And so to your point where you said we're dynamic, let's say there's some new initiative that we want to invest in. And so that requires more engineers and more product people on the product team. Those requests would come in. We will consolidate everything, right? Because if you start in isolation, every 1 role or every 2 roles makes sense, right? But then when you look at it in totality, if every department is adding 4 or 5 roles or whatever it might be, then the cash plan might not work, right? Because every role that you add, unless you get to a point of where you're generating cash, you're going to run out of cash sooner than you expect. And so there is a little bit of what I'll say philosophical and sort of investment decisions that need to be made, which is usually made by the CEO and the C-suite in terms of what areas do we want to invest in for the next quarter, the next 6 months. Because obviously anyone you hire in quarter probably isn't going to make an impact for at least a couple months as they get onboarded.
Right. Let me ask you a few more tactical questions, which is how do you think about compensation, especially in this planning phase? You may get information about who you want to hire at what level, but compensation has been a moving target for the last 12 to 18 months, and it keeps changing. And the variances are like 10, 20, 15%. How are you working in your budget exact compensation?
Yeah, I mean, so our VP of people, works with external parties to do benchmarking on a regular basis for all roles at the company to really understand what is market. But I do think it's important to kind of set up what your philosophy is on compensation and pay. Are you going to pay top of the market, median, or you bring people in at entry level and let them grow? And so what we try to do is we peg a range. And so that way, the department leaders are not pegged into an actual like hard number. But if there's, let's say, a tier 1 talent person, and everyone agrees that we want to go above the budget of what we have in there, that's I'd say reasonably accepted. But at the same time, we have an overall budget that we need to fit. So then, is there another role where you might come in under? And so I think I guess maybe in summary, the way I would answer your question is you have to have sort of a plan of how you're going to approach it, but then you need to build in some flexibility because you may have an all-star that you want to hire and you may have to go above and beyond what you initially set at the budget.
That's great. So what I really like what you said is that you just can't rely on the benchmarks that are now available. You have to actually take that benchmark and make it your own and come up with what is your company's compensation philosophy and then use that as the guiding force. How do you think about the second aspect around organizational design? Are you looking at things like, I would say it's a span of control, in which location you're hiring, and how do you make those decisions, or how does those decisions influence your headcount plan?
I wouldn't say that we target specific geographies to fit into a certain comp band or anything like that. I think we want to have the best person for every seat at the company. Sales headcount planning is really important. So we do look at all those ratios in terms of how many BDRs are supporting AEs, the number of managers to individual contributors, and then how many CSMs you might have to either customers or ARR, depending upon how you build your model. So those are pretty standard benchmarks or ratios that you'd want to use from a planning perspective.
I think now may be a good time to step into some more operationally trying to understand, like, okay, now that you have a plan, you have started executing on that plan, the plan may change. So how do you communicate, or how does the hiring managers communicate those changes to you?
At the beginning of every quarter, the recruiting and people team, they get a list of all the hiring plan that was effectively approved, right? So they have all their recs, they assign recruiters to them, and they go off and start recruiting. Some roles are even, that we know that will get approved because of the lead time. They're probably already being worked on. And so in terms of how updates get made, we meet with our talent team regularly to get updates, but they also have a Google sheet that they update and track each role in. It is manual. I will say that our recruiting team does a great job because they put a high emphasis on data quality and keeping those records up to date. And so effectively every week we're updating our financial model with any updates to new hires, dates that get pushed out, maybe compensation changed because the JD, the job description changed. So all of those things get updated on a weekly, bi-weekly basis. And I think the key to that is just having really good communication with your partners. And that's where the collaborative nature of planning comes into play. I've been in environments where finance is just kind of putting in numbers. And then if you don't get buy-in from your partners, it's hard to really execute against a plan that everybody believes in.
Yeah, collaboration is really key because, and we'll dig deeper into this, is that there are three different systems. Like there's a planning system of record, and there is a application tracking system which is, I would say, the recruiting system of record. And then there is your HRIS, where all the existing employees are there, which may also be going through some churn or change. So all of these three systems have to be in sync. And the three people or the three different departments that manage these systems also have to be in sync. So you spoke about working closely with the talent team. How about internal transfers, backfills, or managing attrition? That may not be. Who is responsible to pass on that information to you?
Yeah, so there's another Google sheet that we use where all of those changes that you just described get inputted on a weekly basis. And then we also get a download from our HRIS system with all the active headcount. So we effectively take that the following week and do a reconciliation against the model. So that way, our financial model is never more than 4 to 5 days out of date. And so that sheet is populated by our people operations team. And sometimes there's no changes, and then other times there's a lot of changes, just depending upon whatever week might be happening.
So 2 follow-up questions there. The first one, why the importance of having the model up to date and not being, off by more than 4 or 5 days?
So I think I think the longer you let something get out of sync with reality, the more likely you are to make mistakes when you have to go update it. So as you can imagine, it's kind of like biting off a little bit every week. So I've been in scenarios where we don't update headcount for, let's say 4 or 6 weeks or something like that. And when you do that, then you might have 40 roles that you have to go and update. And if you're manually updating 40 rows in a model, you're more likely to make a mistake, maybe miscode a date or something like that. And it takes a lot longer too, rather than taking 10 minutes once a week and just updating it. So I think that in terms of the data quality is really important, and doing it more frequently, we feel like has a better consistency ratio.
Are you reporting these numbers up the chain to department leaders and also the CEO at the same weekly cadence?
So not the individual changes, but like we do look at the forecast on a weekly and bi-weekly basis in terms of like where we think the quarter is going to end, the end of the year, where cash is, where our different KPIs that we look at. In terms of whether it's revenue growth or CAC or unit economics, all of those sorts of metrics are things that I look at on a daily, weekly basis. How often we share them out, depending upon the audience and sort of the relative change from the prior version, that's what can kind of be different depending upon sort of the environment that you're working in.
So now we spoke about the individual processes. We spoke about how different teams, how you're engaging with the different teams. You did mention that this is a manual process involving multiple spreadsheets and the dependence on having someone to manually update this data. Can you share some best practices on, because I would say many companies are in the same boat. There's a Google Sheet for that respective departments are sharing with each other. What is your recommendation, or what is your suggestion that you would give based on your experience to heads of HR on how they should work with finance? And then I'll ask you about the other departments as well.
The most important thing is having a consistent process that's documented and making sure that everyone's on the same page with how things will work either on a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly basis. And then, as I said before, putting a heavy emphasis on data quality, because those inputs that the either talent or people team provide the finance team has a downstream impact from a financial modeling perspective, how it impacts metrics, and then decisions are made. So investments maybe to further marketing spend, pull back on marketing spend, or hire more people are all made based on kind of what the sort of financial outlook of the company is going to be. And so I think that's why it's really important having really good data. And so in terms of like tips for a hiring managers out there, I would just say working really closely with your finance partners and sharing data and meeting with them on a regular basis is really important.
Right. And so I think it's the bedrock is all about having a well-defined process, following the process, and then keeping the data integrity up to date by regularly meeting and sharing that information.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
I think this brings us to our final question, which is very appropriate in this new world, given how the market has changed. And if you go back in the last 24 months, we were growing at all costs because there was a lot of cash available. And now funding is harder to come by. How are you working with your CEO in changing how you plan and how you look at headcount So what would be your suggestion to other finance leaders how they should be planning for the next 18, 24 months?
Yeah, so I think what's really important, I think this applies to kind of most businesses, but definitely for sales-led organizations, is really understanding your revenue model and how your sales headcount can impact that. So do you have enough sales rep and quota assigned to hit your revenue targets? Did you account for ramp time in your plan, or are you assuming 100% quota assignment on month one? And then does your revenue expansion plan include a new product from the product team and product and engineering team? Well, is that product dependent on hiring a PM to actually build the product with the engineering team? When's that actually going to get released? Because you have to launch the product before you can actually sell the product, right? And then I think it's also thinking from a downside and running different cases. So if your sales were to fall 10, 20%, what does that do to your cash runway? So I think running different scenarios to understand the range of different outcomes. It's very easy for a finance person to build a model and say revenue is going to be X in 2025. We all know revenue will not be X. It's a range of values and outcomes, and there's a range of probabilities and possibilities. And so I think it's important for the finance person to be able to communicate to the entire leadership team the sort of confidence level on what that projection is, or give a range of values.
Right. So I think the three keywords that, from this conversation is that you have to be agile, you have to be iterative, you have to be collaborative. I think your final thoughts on, like, especially by headcount, has your outlook to how you give how do you approve new headcount requests, or how do you approve backfills changed?
Yeah. I mean, I think probably in the past, at many companies, you tend to assume that any role will, like from a backfill perspective, will get filled. And I think also when it's a one incremental role, it's like, well, it's just one more person. Let's add it and hire it. So I do think the bar to get additional roles hired at all companies now is a lot higher. And so it's really important to kind of manage that process and, like, who gets to approve it? What's the sort of benchmark that you need to hit to get a role approved? And it really comes down to, like, picking your bets. You can't necessarily just hire a bunch of people and expect that growth is going to materialize. I think a lot of it comes down to being really focused. I think there's a lot of studies that go back, like if you look at startups back in 2010 to 2012, the number of employees that they had before they got to different milestones of 10 million, 50 million, and 100 million of revenue was way smaller than it is now. Part of that is because of how the funding environment was very different in the second part of the last decade than the first part of the decade.
Yeah, I was just reading a recent article that said there were 15 employees, average number of employees for the Series A company. And now that is closer to 28 to 35. Yep. So I think the key message is that moving forward, we all have to be really intentional on headcount requests or headcount management, and continue to have this laser focus on, like, what bets are we making, as you rightly said, and how long it would take for that bet to materialize before we make a decision to invest in headcount.
And I think one other thing I would say is that many times less is more. You can actually get more done with less people, and hiring more people isn't necessarily always the answer. Obviously, you need to hire people to grow. But sometimes when you have scarce resources, you can come up with a little bit more unique solutions to things. It makes you kind of think a little bit harder. And one of my fundamental philosophies is, rather than try to fix the problem, go to the source of the problem and fix that. So don't try to cut the problem off at the source of it, opposed to trying to just band-aid it with more people.
Yeah. So no more throwing bodies at the problem. Go solve the problem.
Right.
I think Krishna, that was great. Thank you so much for spending time with the Headcount people. some great insights that our listeners would really enjoy. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks to Tushar. It was great talking with you.